Hello, good early evening, ladies and gentlemen. This is a live stream that will be more philosophically focused, and this is sort of an extension of the Philosophy Society that is here at BISLA, in Bratislava International School of Liberal Arts, where students are able to sit down in a group outside of school premises with professors and guest speakers, where there is an open floor basically to discuss different philosophical issues, texts, and so on. And the aim is to nurture discussion basically and to let people share their opinions and sort of not come to a consensus per se, because I don't think that's ever really possible in philosophy, but maybe reach a deeper understanding of a certain topic. And it's the largest and longest functioning society at BISLA, and we're all very proud of it. And every member that's a part of it is glad to take part in the discussions. So
right now we are kind of in a limited group because we're also kind of trying out this new format of live streaming it. And it's all new. That's also why we're a little bit late and didn't catch on the strict 6 p.m. deadline. But that's kind of, I think, a part of philosophy, that deadlines are only relative. Yeah, and also for Slovak speakers, I will just switch very briefly to Slovak just to kind of give a very brief overview. Že by som rád privítal všetkých tu na našom live streame. Tento celý live stream budeme v angličtine, lebo aj na BISLA študujeme skoro všetky predmety v angličtine, takže aj je to pre nás taký aj prirodzenejší jazyk, keď sa rozprávame o odborných veciach, ale chceli by sme to aj tak otvoriť všetkým vám, takže aby ste počúvali a možno sa niečo nové dozvedeli, a budeme sa venovať práve ako by možno filozofia trochu reagovala na súčasnú pandémiu, a je to takým predložením, čo robia aj študenti po večeroch a po obede na BISLE, kedy sa stretávajú vo všelijakých spolkoch a trávia spolu čas, či už pri pohári vína, piva, alebo len tak, a diskutujú o všetkom, čo vidia, a rozprávajú sa o tom. To je veľmi dôležitá súčasť toho, čo robíme na BISLE, že to nie je len o tom, čo sa učíme v triede, ale aj o tom, keď vyjdeme von a rozprávame sa aj o iných veciach, možno niečo, čo je nám bližšie, a niečo, čo nerobíme kvôli kreditom, ale kvôli tomu, že nás to naozaj baví a naplňa. Takže mohli by sme to takto odštartovať asi. Len aby som to ešte uviedol, tak prvý pôjde Alex. On si pre vás pripravil niečo o tom, ako prebiehala taká epidémia počas Athén, teda v antických Atenách. And so we will start with the pandemic, or rather epidemic in ancient Athens, and how that played out and what that kind of caused. And then each of us will kind of present some kind of reading, and we all encourage you to join in the comments, ask questions, or comment on anything and add your thoughts to it, because that's what it is. It's a big discussion.
So to start off with, this plague of Athens will be more or less a comparison of how the plague panned out in ancient times, and then we can compare it to how it works in our times. So the important fact is that when the plague hit Athens, Athens were currently in their golden age of their advancements in science, in technology. They built many of the ancient world wonders like Statue of Zeus or Temple of Artemis. But then they got into the war, the Peloponnesian War with Sparta and the Delian League. And during this war, Athens had to retreat within their walls while their strength was on the sea, and Sparta had dominant army, land army. But while everybody from Athens had had been forced to be contained within one walls, suddenly a plague broke out. This plague had been described by Thucydides in his writings, and it was sort of something similar to bubonic plague, which was in 1300s. But in Athens, we can see the disastrous effect of this plague on the society when, for example, in this quote from Thucydides, that people, while this plague was ravaging the streets of Athens, basically lost all hope that anything will get better. And while they believed that this was actually brought upon them by the god or the divinity, they thought that God basically left them, and they stopped obeying, for example, burial practices, which were like the most important thing about Greek culture was their burial rites. And they basically, during this plague, just left piles of dead bodies on the streets, burned them together. People were walking naked around the streets. So basically the whole society broke down, and this plague was basically what brought down the Athenian Empire, while Athens never fully recovered from this plague. So on this example of Athens, we can see that if people lose hope during the plague, it's much worse than what the plague can do by itself, because if society just stops existing because something bad is happening, well, then it's gonna bring a disaster towards the later times when the plague will be over. And Athens experienced this because of this plague, they lost the war with Sparta, and Sparta took over Athens, and Athens never managed to come to their glory ever again. So that's basically it for the plague and what was happening during it. But one interesting fact actually about Thucydides was that during these times, Thucydides was the first writer who noticed that the plague was spreading from the diseased people to healthy people, which might sound stupid, but for their times, this was actually a really important observation, because he was the first one to basically introduce social distancing, which we have to experience in today's probably everyone. And Thucydides was the guy who invented it, who said that people should stay far apart from the sick and dead because they might contract the disease. So that is the impact of Thucydides in for medicine and for the how do you say it? How society should react when there is pandemic. And even though Thucydides was just an historian, he was the guy who basically invented this whole process of social distancing. And this other quote that is currently on the screen is basically the disruption of the society and how what I said before, that it is much worse to fall into the despair and and just believe that nothing will ever get better and treat your life as if you are dead anyway, and it will bring bigger disaster than the plague can ever by itself. Yeah, that's pretty much it.
I think we can thank Alex for his section, and I will just take over and go to my section that is dealing with Michel Foucault and his piece in Discipline and Punish. It's kind of on the bird of prison. It's kind of very interesting, and especially when you're reading the whole book and you get to the very important concept for him of a panopticon. So kind of a building in which everybody is watched, and at the same time everybody's feeling that they're under control, and in this way you kind of create a very immersive power that kind of makes sure that everybody feels that they're unchecked, and therefore they kind of subscribe to the ideals or keep living their life as if they were watched. And it's interesting that this kind of like one of the largest concepts for Foucault are, and the whole chapter is starting with the concept of plague. And he's talking about what plague did during 17th century, and he was a writer of 20th century, but he was talking about what happened in 17th century when the plague hit the town, especially a medieval town in which the plague was, as is also kind of pointed out here in this quote, it was like a reverse of the collective festival. So it was this absolute time of like strict divisions. And how he saw the plague and what followed out of it, it's kind of a dream for a ruler that wants to take a very authoritative and kind of complete control and kind of create a very strong political correlative discipline within its society because of the nature of how to treat plague or any pandemic. They very soon realized that how the plague or pandemic or any virus spreads is from person to person. So what they need to do is to create, and this is also very visible in his description of how would medieval town react to it, that they would force families to kind of stay indoors, and they would kind of create these very strict divisions within the cities to divide people and not let them to meet each other and kind of limit the spread to a specific part. But by doing this, they kind of create a much harsher hierarchy that exists beforehand. Because while you could before kind of freely walk around or do anything like that, this might not be a case of plague. And plague is a very good kind of a justification for any of those measurements to take place. And we can see it even now that people tend to accept much harsher restrictions in their lives now that they would not otherwise be acceptable beforehand, because there is this big scary image of a virus that can catch you, and therefore you are more likely to subscribe to this restriction and be kind of acceptable of them, at least for some time. But Foucault did not only see this as something that is kind of stopping with this like kind of attempt to enforce certain division and kind of divide the city and control everybody's health, but it also creates something else, that it's not only about the mask that are put on the faces and you kind of anonymize a little bit of the people and you kind of force them to hide and force them to kind of to be subservient, but it creates possibility of massive assignment or categorization of people. And this happens because you need to keep track of like which person is getting sick, which person, what is their mental health, or what is their health in general, where they're living, with whom they are meeting, what kind of job they are doing. And because of that, even medieval cities start doing very fast, very quickly, they start putting together lists of people, and by that you could assign what Foucault said, that their true names, their true place, their true body, and their true disease. Because even though the categorization was necessary for kind of a bureaucratic running of the city and kind of trying to overcome the disease, that list do not disappear after the pandemic is ended or after the crisis is over, but they remain there and they create categories, because then those people that, and especially that was the case with leprosy, that people that got sick with leprosy were ostracized from society and were pushed away from the core, and this kind of creates this opportunity to create the new categories of like getting rid of some of your political opponents by declaring if they get sick, they're kind of lesser, they're kind of more subsequent, they can be corrupted, they've been caught by the disease and therefore they're not good enough or something like that. But also then ascribing them specific place within the society, because by creating this very strict hierarchy and lists, you kind of rank people on their where they live, how important their job is. We can say it even now with the discussion of like what is essential work, what is really the work that needs to be done, and what is kind of work that can be done from home, or what is the work that actually we are finding out that it's not that important for running of the society. And because of that, we are creating completely new society, and we are reimagining what our place, not on the physical but also within the structures, is. So that would be something that I would probably add from the Foucault's thought on the plague, and how it's also makes out of us this not really how would you say it makes our societies into something different than it was before the pandemic. And we are pretty sure that this is also what is going to take place now, that we know that the society, and by the way how we redefine what is essential, what is important, what is our place, what is our work, and how it functions, we really redefine how the society functions. And at the same time, it's a very huge, it's a great opportunity also for the rulers and for those that are in charge, because it gives them a really big power in terms of disciplining the society and kind of getting almost anything out of anybody in this day and time. And that's why we can see that some, for example, human rights groups are very vocal about any laws that would go beyond the period of this emergency, and be very worried about adopting any new regulations. Because what and this is my last point, and I promise that I will let Nate talk. But this is why I'm looking at the quote, that it's not only that you kind of transgress the laws and you kind of go against them, but what you make, you kind of describe the laws and you create regulations that suddenly you need to control whether people are covering their faces, how they're shopping, those like very essential parts, how they're visiting their elderly. And these are the regulations that otherwise would not be present, are suddenly becoming part of the norms and part of the social laws and part of the actual laws, and some of them stay. And so this is why this whole situation is a very huge opportunity to also restrict freedom, which at this time is justifiable to some extent, but in the long term might be a very problematic thing to do. So I think that's it from me, and hopefully it added something, and I hope, and I'm leaving the word to Nate to continue with his piece.
So Mati actually left me with a great point to segue off of, where I'll be discussing mostly the sort of reactions to the lockdowns, to the quarantines that have been going on worldwide. And as Mate mentioned, with the idea that it's the perfect time for governments to sort of step in and increase their control. And I think that this is one of the reasons why the reaction, especially in the United States, has been so negative. But also, if you speak to people from Slovakia, for example, which has history as a former Soviet state, especially among the older generation, there's a lot of fear behind the sort of laws that are being put into place to fight back the virus. A lot of them are afraid that, is this going to stay after the quarantine ends? This reminds me of 30 years ago. This reminds me of 35 years ago. And I think that is part of the reason why so many people are opposed to the current situation. But that's just kind of my own opinion on that regard. And so today I'll be focusing on, as I said, the United States and the liberate movements that have been going on in certain states. And I'll be referencing John Stuart Mills, who was a liberal political philosopher. And I'll be focusing especially on freedom of association. And so what freedom of association is it's basically association in social terms is how we interact with people. It's basically how we form relationships. And so we have two types of relationships that exist, and those are intimate associations and collective associations. And so the delineation between the two is sort of vague, because you can have collective associations that are relatively intimate, and you can have intimate associations that aren't so intimate in themselves. But the point is that intimate relationships tend to be parents, family members, close friends, partners, so on. And collective associations are anything from classmates to colleagues to people that I'm in a club with, for example. But the point is that Stuart Mills points out that one of the most important freedoms for people is this freedom of association, that it's basically at the core of our freedoms, because it's what makes us human. Basically, we're social creatures, and as long as we have this freedom, we innately have the right to basically choose what society we think is best suited to us. And so obviously now with the lockdown and with the quarantine, people are being forced to stay away from these associations. And I believe that this is a big reason why so many people are reacting negatively to this, because they are having, as Mills proclaims, one of their most essential freedoms being taken away from them. They are not able to spend time with distant family members, with close friends, even with colleagues. And so it points out that even if you're someone that lives with your partner, for example, you still feel like you're missing out on something. And so it kind of highlights the importance of these collective associations. You know, you go to work and you say, oh, these people are just my work friends. And then you realize, you know, you spend a month and a half away from these people. You're like, wow, I actually really miss being around these people. And this is because we value associations so much with these people. And I think that this could also be a factor into the protests that are going on in the United States. But there's a very important caveat that Mills points out in this, and this kind of diminishes this correlation between the two, because Mills also states that an important notion is the harm principle. And the harm principle basically postulates that you have the freedom to do something so long, or you have the freedom to stop someone from doing something as long as it prevents someone from being harmed. And obviously, when there's a global pandemic going on and you have people gathering en masse, there's a lot of people being put at risk. Whether directly at harm is debatable, and that would actually be a question I would ask: is putting someone at risk the same thing as harming them? I'm not so sure. I am of a mind that putting someone at risk is probably not equivalent, but is very closely related to putting someone at harm. I guess it's more semantic than anything, really. But I think that this distance is really kind of what's getting to people. The fact that, what do you spend most of your day doing if you are a average working human being? You're around people. And when you have this taken away and you're either alone or you're around the same 3 people maybe every day, you start to feel infringed upon. And I think that this is why people have reacted so powerfully, basically. And so that's my spiel on this. And I guess this doesn't necessarily relate just to the plague. But I think in general, this whole lockdown situation really highlights a lot of things about human nature that were not maybe considered as much, or not considered as important. For example, I went cycling 2 or 3 weeks back, and along the Danube here in Bratislava, there were more people out like along the river on that day than I had seen like on an average day during the summer. And that was just like really shocking to me, because I would have assumed that people would have thought, I don't want to put my young kids at risk. I don't want to put my wife at risk, my husband at risk. But people still did it anyway. And I think it kind of shows that people need to feel connected to each other somehow. So yeah, that's kind of how I view this whole situation. That's what I've taken from it.
Thank you. I would, before we go any further, I would probably suggest, if you have any questions or thoughts or something that came up also to those that are watching us or listening to us, that you can of course comment and we can react to it or do anything with it. And if not, then I know that Nate had something that he wanted to a little bit open up, and maybe we can discuss for a brief before we wait if there are any comments, and then we can probably close this. Or if Alex has any reactions to any of us or Nate.
I was actually a question for Alex. So you said that Thucydides was the person that recommended social distancing, basically.
Mm-hmm.
And do you know if people in Athens actually did that?
Well, the problem with the Athens was that everybody from around like the city of Athens had to go inside the walls because it was their strategy to not have anybody outside. So they basically quarantined the city, and they had the walls so they could get supplies from Piraeus, which was their port.
Mm-hmm.
But the problem with this was that there were so many people that when people started dying, you had nowhere to run away from that. That's the reason why, well, the longer the plague went, the less people the longer the plague went on, the less people were willing to treat the dead ones, the dying ones or the sick ones, because they noticed slowly that people are dying, mostly those that are in the contact with those that are already infected, but they had nowhere to run from. So basically only after a third of the population died, they finally had the space to go in and social distance, but they couldn't. There was nowhere to go. But I had actually a question for you. While you were discussing like that people perceive it as their constitutional right and everything to all of those basic things. But then how far can government go before it becomes unconstitutional law?
This is a really big talking point in U.S. politics and U.S. Legality, basically, because the Constitution is extremely vague. And so you had in the early foundation of the United States, for example, you had two different political parties at the time, where one was for a more strict interpretation of the Constitution, and you had one that was more loosely interpreting the Constitution. And so it's extremely difficult to say where a line actually is drawn, because it doesn't specify. If you like read through the Bill of Rights, for example, it's so open. Like you can read something, and I guarantee you every third person will think something completely different of it. Every third person will think, okay, this is where the line's drawn. And so I think, as I said before, with the harm principle, I think that this is kind of one of the more important moral principles, that you can do whatever you want, as long as it doesn't put someone else at harm. And I feel like, in my own opinion, I would not say that this is unconstitutional in any way, because it's literally preventing people from getting sick and dying. So that's my opinion, at least. And like I said, you could debate on and to the end of the days about the limits and the borderlines of the Constitution, and you'll never come to a conclusion.
Well, it seems kind of comic. Like this is like the most stupid thing to see people protesting against state regulation for them to not group together. Like you just see how like I don't know, is it because the people like don't actually believe that the disease is dangerous, or is it because like they don't care?
It's misinformation, and I think the biggest problem that goes on here is that because of the fact that the United States society, especially, is so polarized that anything that doesn't sort of fit someone's own narrative on how they view things will generally be viewed as something hostile. And so they'll say that this is someone trying to, manipulate me. This is someone trying to mislead me. And of course, I'm generalizing, but this is the biggest problem. And especially amongst radicals, you see this the most amongst radicals. And I think that in general, again, I'm generalizing, but if you were to go to one of these protests, it would probably be the more radical people that would be out on the streets.
But also, you cannot downplay the economic pressure that is coming from it.
And that is also true. I mean, you have to understand that. I mean, I think pretty much in almost every state, there's almost 20% unemployment because of the virus.
And it's much more rapidly growing than in the Europe because of how the social welfare system works.
Yeah.
Which in Europe would rather like you officially stay in job and you receive money while you are at home. But in the US, you either are out or in.
Yeah.
And if you are out, you cannot get you cannot get paid while you are out. So
there's absolutely no support system. I mean, you can get unemployment checks, but those don't really cover, especially if you live in a city, for example. That will not cover your rent. That won't cover your mortgage. Yeah, it's just a rough situation. And I understand why people are so fearful of shutting down the economy. I don't agree with like shutting down the economy completely either, because I think that the repercussions of it would be unbearable. But at the same time, I think that a bit of reason and a bit of sort of compassion and empathy would do a lot of people a lot of good.
But actually, another question came to my mind from this, like, because I don't really have that much knowledge on America, but do you think that it will have impact on like the elections that will come about and then further for the progress of America?
I would hope so. I suppose the outcome that I can imagine, and again, this is going to be somewhat, it's going to be very subjective point of view, but the people who will vote for Trump are going to vote for Trump no matter what. And those are the people that are motivated to vote. And I think that at most what this will do is it will motivate the people who don't want Trump to vote, because that was always the biggest problem, is that there just weren't enough people who were against him that were willing to vote, or that had the sense of obligation to vote, basically. And I would hope that this whole situation and the way the pandemic was handled at the start, and even now, it's being very, very poorly handled, in my opinion. Hopefully it motivates.
It will depend on how strong the virus will, or how the pandemic will result in the key states, because it doesn't really. But this is also the case almost in any country that the epidemic, it's usually only in specific regions, so it does not hit equally everything. And this is why also you could see that especially in the US, but also in some other countries, especially if they're larger, that there are people are protesting if a whole country is under lockdown, even though the really hit part is only like a very small section of the population. Because also like even within Slovakia, it's much more likely that the cities will be much more hit because of the social interactions that is happening. And you could just lock down specific regions, a specific group of towns, and you don't have to lock down everything in theory, but that's kind of what is also kind of playing into it.
It's interesting though, because I've noticed when I travel to work, the city's starting to fill up again. I was on Obchodna yesterday, and it was at like noon or 1 o'clock, and it looked like a normal day. So I'm curious how this pans out.
Yeah,
Fortunately for us, we haven't been hit so hard. We've taken it pretty easy so far, but I'm curious how it'll look in a month from now.
Yeah, I noticed too, like after the first wave of the reopening, like every time I go out, it's not even that weird anymore. Like people are really just lost the tension from them.
Yeah,
you can see way more people without like face masks or gloves outside, so it feels like it's getting better.
Yeah, the aura of fear, because like I remember it felt kind of oppressive when you go outside during the first 2 weeks or so, because you could just feel how scared people were and how uncertain it was. And it's going away. I think it's good that it's going away, but I hope that it doesn't mean that people start letting their guard down, basically, and assuming everything's back to normal, because it won't be back to normal for a while, I think.
The question is whether we will we will most likely create new normal, because certain things will probably have to be adapted, especially, for example, I can imagine regarding air travels, which you would have to do some kind of health check.
Yeah.
As part of like a normal procedure that would be mandatory almost every time. And this kind of thing, also about like enormous effect on either education or healthcare, and also about how we perceive work, because we kind of figure out right now that how many of those meetings could be in just a Zoom or could be in just an email, and we are finding out that we don't actually have to go to work every single day to work. So we might see some kind of changes in this regard. But for that, I will do a plug-in, because I think we are close to the end. I will plug in our conference that we are organizing at BISLA, which is called The World After the Pandemic, and it's gonna be online, and it's gonna be on 29th and 30th of May. And tomorrow is the last day to send the abstract, so either go to bisla.sk or go to theworldafterthepandemic.wordpress.com, and you can find all the information there. Also, we have a Facebook event and so on and so on. But yeah, so we're gonna discuss much more about how the pandemic is gonna affect the world as whole, and how it's gonna touch on different topics from minorities to philosophy. I think this is the perfect way to end. So
yeah.
Thank you guys, and hopefully we'll see each other again. And thanks everybody for watching. And if you have any questions about BISLA or what we do there, feel free to ask. And there will be more activities coming on in the next few days.
Peace to the world.
Okay.